Bismillah. Back with Kayvon here doing final podcast on who was Baha'ullah. Kayvon, Jan, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
We're okay. We're okay.
Okay, Wahid, my question, you know, my question for you is, Baha'u'llah's demagoguery appealed to the Baha'is' worst instincts,
Mhm.
right? Conspiracy theories that once confide, actually, to the fringe are going viral again. It is as if the age of reason and objective argument is on the verge of utter and permanent failure. Scientific consensus is totally dismissed.
Mhm.
Democracy that leans on the shared truth is in retreat, and autocracy, on the other hand, which depends on shared lies and misgivings, is on the march. Baha'u'llah triggered outrage, rampage, and fear, and ultimately outperformed objective dissidents. Nevertheless, my question goes back to one Abul-Fazl Golpaigani,
Mhm.
who you usually refer to as Mirza Abul Razl. You know, he is believed to have taken some measures, to fight kind of racism, predominant racism, and to abolish apartheid, But on one certain occasion, right, an ex-Baha'i skillfully made Mirza Abul Fazl Golpaigani to let down his guard off and reveal what he really felt about the whole Bahaism.
Mhm.
Apparently, on a very negative note, he suddenly broke off the character to ensure his young guest that had it not been for his safety and survival, he would have exposed and candidly debunked the father and son,
Mhm.
Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, to the public. And perhaps that's why he was sort of banished from the vicinity of Ahibba or friends.
Mhm.
What's your take on this
Well,
story?
the take on this story is the following. There's a saying in Persian that the Baha'is love to cite from Abbas Afandi. The Persian is Vasa'il wusul be husn khatime majhul, which is something along the lines of all's well that ends well, except uh, there's more depth to this saying than that. The fact is that Abul Raz Legol Poyagani, in the final closing days of his life, actually spoke the truth about the whole thing. Abul Fazl Golpayagani, or Abul Razael, as I call him, he was a paid individual. The Baha'i apparatus needed uh, individuals of capacity within the seminary establishment of Iran who were slightly, amenable to this sort of agenda, so they bought it outright, and basically paid his way and elevated his status amongst the Baha'is, etc. And he basically wrote their line for a good 30 years.
Sorry,
Um,
are you suggesting that his conversion to Baha'ism was out of destitute and
Of
poverty?
course, absolutely. And he actually says it himself in so many words, where he basically says that Baha'ism is nothing but a political movement. And if that's the case, all you need to do is put two and two together um, to realize the fact that this guy was being paid. He was a professional propagandist for the Baha'is. Now, just
On a
remember,
facade, right?
as a facade,
Put on a
he apparently his condition was quite destitute before he came to all of this. And so the Baha'is found this opportunity. They bought the guy, you know. So Abul Ras Legol Payagani didn't come into the Baha'i milieu with any conviction. He came as a means to elevate his financial status, and they did it for him. Whether it was in Iran itself or afterwards when he went to Bukhara and Tashkent and Ashgabat, and then later when he found his way to Egypt, he was being how should one put it? He was being maintained. He was a kept scholar, as it were, a professional pen for hire. And we see this extremely, in a very conspicuous way, in the final work that they commissioned him to write, which was that Kashf al-Qata, where him and his brother proceeded to debunk the Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Kaf and the edition that E.G. Brown put out.
Of course, Mr. Azal, the purpose of that book was allegedly that of strict religious proselytization, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And the founding of a narrative, against the Bayani community.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
And that's exactly what it was. And a narrative that now, thanks to the discovery of the Princeton manuscript that came from the collection of William M. Miller, which originally belonged to Sayyid Khani Kordestani, and also the fact that we are aware that there are other manuscripts, older manuscripts of the Nuqtat al-Kaf in existence. One of them, which is apparently among the collection of the late Ayatollah Marashi Najafi in Qom. We know that entire narrative is now false, that the Times have actually proven that this narrative was a manufactured narrative. Number one, the Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Kaf was not a text that was manufactured by the Bayanis, by the Azalis, and that many of the points of view that are in that text were actually points of view of an earlier period of Babism. And texts beside the Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Kaf, even some of the things that Subha Azal has written from that period confirm that point of view. So this was not a text, as Abbas Effendi initially crafted it, basically written to, basically manufactured ex nihilo and then sold to Mr. E.G. Brown and A.L.M. Nicola as an authentic text. When you have a text such as the one in Princeton, which is from the period of 1853, only 1 year after the events of the failed assassination of Nasruddin Shah, the fact is that this text is proven to be an original text.
Could you perhaps provide some insights, as to the background of the high-profile Baha'is? Because, there is some specific sequence, in Edward Brown's narrative, when, for instance, Baha'ullah used to take abandoned, and undernourished people in his arms, right? A mullah, shall we say, who is sickly looking and wizened and without much of the charm, that the mullahs possess at that age, But Baha'u'llah looks down, at them with dauntless encouragement and enthusiasm, and say, quote, "See, this is life in you." It is an undeniably, affirmative moment.
Look, I would rephrase the question. I would look at it in this sense. The reality of a professional propagandist like Mirza Abul Razak Golpayakani not only has to be blamed and put at the door of the Baha'is, but you also have to look at the very serious problems that existed in Iran of the time, and especially within the clerical class itself. And that is that in that seminary clerical class, everything operated on the basis of patronage. And it's still the case even today. And today it's even more centralized than it was 100-something years ago. So if you had gone through the curriculum at the Hausa for 10, 15 years and come out with patronage, no question, your career would be elevated. You would get probably one of the better posts as Imam Jomain in a city like Tehran or Yazd or Qom itself or Mashhad, etc. If you didn't have patronage, or if your patronage was someone who was controversial or not well known or not well liked, etc., etc., it didn't matter how learned you were. It didn't matter who even you had studied with. Your career would basically go nowhere, and you would basically spend most of your life in penury. This is the situation of the patronage systems that exist in the Shiite 12 or Shiite clericocracy. And it's even today, this still exists, whether we're talking about Iran or Iraq. So you have to look at it from that perspective. When someone of the stature and learning of Mirza Abul-Fazl Golpayagani finds himself in a destitute situation, with his future prospects of going through the hierarchy of patronage very grim, and then you have these Baha'is fishing in muddy waters, it's obvious that this particular fish is going to bite because his livelihood depends on it. Maybe he has a family, maybe he has relations that are destitute or are being exploited, by the feudal landlords at the time. All of this stuff was going on in 19th century Iran. So when these Baha'is came and fished in muddy waters, people as desperate as Mirza Abul Razak Golpayagani was, it's natural that they would do anything. They would become propagandists. They would sell themselves, their soul, their learning, everything. And unfortunately, this is a condition that very few people who have looked at the conditions of that period with figures such as Mirza Abul Razak Golpayagani, they have not looked at it. They've tried to frame this guy as some kind of a long-suffering hero, etc. But we have one of his final statements. This statement was quoted directly by Avare in his Kashf al-Hil, and this statement has never been debunked by the Baha'is. The Baha'is have not claimed that this is a false statement, where he denounces the whole thing, and basically says that this is just a whole political movement. It has no further reality.
This alleged story was corroborated by other sources.
Yes, and it was corroborated subsequently by Avare's own experience as well. Let's not forget that Ayati was, kind of
high profile,
very high profile. He was, in a sense, a sort of a successor to Mirza Abul Razak Golpayagani. They commissioned him to write the first history of the Baha'i faith, the Kawakib al-Durriyah. And then once he had his falling out with the Baha'i machinery and he denounced his own publication, his own history, they did the same sorts of things. But at least he spilled the beans in 2 massive volumes of Kashf al-Hil about what had happened to him and what kind of things that these people were doing. The extremely manipulative mechanisms that were at work and all the rest of it. So this was when you look at a figure like Avare and what he tells us about his experience, and then you read that back into that small statement made by Mirza Abul-Fazl Golpayagani, we can basically surmise and conclude that the exact same thing was going on in this case as well.
So you believe the whole body of the scholarship was a mere exercise in propaganda,
Well, he says it. He says it. In so many words. Because he says it himself.
Them down. For instance, I believe Mirza Abul-Fazl Golpayagani also never pretended that his work, was anything but a fundamentalist religious campaign, right?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Okay. My second question, Mr. Azal, let's go over the saga of Baha'ullah in Akka, because 4 high-profile Bayanis, followers of Sope Azals, were killed, and this gruesome murder, this, gruesome and heinous crime was perpetrated, on the direct order of Baha'ullah. Baha'ullah was subpoenaed, and incarcerated for 1 day or 2. But, he was granted clemency and walked loose afterward. Why, Mr. Azal? Why?
Well, for some reason, they managed to convince the Ottoman authorities in Akka that this was just a religious thing. One thing that they did do, and we are finding more and more and more evidence of this, is that they presented a case to the Ottoman authorities, especially in Akka, that they were basically Muslims with a Sufi bent, and that Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah was just a Sufi sheikh. So, yeah, and that this is a huge lie. And so based on this, and given the Ottoman experience with Sufism and multiple Sufi orders and tendency, etc., they sort of relented, especially um, after the cover-up of the murders was so well perpetrated by the Baha'is that the Ottomans could no longer, basically pursue a case against them. After a very short period of time, they let Baha'u'llah out, and also because they had money. So immediately after Baha'u'llah comes out of prison in Accra, they buy a house, which they call the House of Abud, and it's this big, kind of complex in Accra itself, where they then housed Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri. And then shortly after that, they bought two other properties. One of them Baji, another one a property called Mazra'e. And this is the question that I think the cognitive dissonance that a lot of Baha'is don't confront. How is it that a destitute prisoner of the Ottomans can afford these lavish properties in Akkar and outside of it if he's a prisoner?
Lavish properties.
Yeah, and who is allowing these acquisitions?
Zahid, he procured a lot of fortune, right?
Yes.
A significant capital. How did it come to pass?
Well, through the fact that he was in control of the Bobby machinery, like I've spoken in the past. So immediately after he makes this claim, all the monies that were supposed to be, coming, the khums that was supposed to be, the right of Sopa Azal and the Bayani community, suddenly he acquired it through this. But we also have evidence, and this is from the late Baghdad period, just on the eve before they left Baghdad for Istanbul, that a very wealthy Babi Tojar by the name of I forget his name now, Jawahiri, Mirza Jawahiri. He bequeathed his entire inheritance to Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri.
Really?
Yeah. Musa Jawahiri, his name was. And so this was a sizable fortune. So on the eve when they are leaving Baghdad, Baha'u'llah is actually leaving Baghdad with a very sizable monetary fortune. And then this is separate from the fact that, he was in control of these networks of money and communication that were coming from the Babis of Iran, to the seat that was supposed to be in Baghdad with Sopa Azal. So by the time in the late 1860s when he made his claim, he was already de facto in control of all of this anyway.
Right.
He was already in control of the monetary networks.
And take as one unremarked example, a very controversial one, the visit of Nasir Baghdadi.
Yes.
Who was allegedly, an immediate executioner and hammer, to Baha'u'llah. Is that true?
Yes.
And he was among the persons, such as that guy, what was his name? Muhammad Ali Salmani,
Yes, he was on the same.
Muhammad Ali Salmani, who murdered, the four Bayanis.
Yeah, but Nasir Baghdadi had also murdered the two witnesses of the Bayan and the brothers-in-law of the primal point, Siraj and Kahir. He was responsible for their murder in Baghdad.
And he was a cold-blooded murderer.
He was a cold-blooded murderer. Yes, Nasir Baghdadi. Yeah, he was.
By the way, Baha'u'llah never expressed any remorse or regret about killing those innocent guys, which makes him, kind of a psychopath.
Yeah, and also proves his complacence in the whole thing. Contrary to what the Baha'is say, the Baha'is have gone, in their pseudo-historiography, manufactured historiography, they have gone out of their way to try to claim that, Baha'u'llah himself had nothing to do with these murders. But, we don't have any actual denunciations, or denunciations aside, he never actually expresses regret for the passing of any of these individuals.
Right. And it's very interesting, because I believe Baha'u'llah, was the real mastermind of that rampage.
Of course. Without his say-so, nothing would have happened. He was completely in control of his so-called believers, or rather his
I believe
mafia.
he called on a strike, right? And his cronies complied immediately, right?
Yeah. There are
What?
portions of these tablets from the Ederne and early Akka period that Mirza Khani Kermani and Sheikh Ahmed Ruhi quote in Ashbehesht, where Baha'u'llah very unequivocally instructs, at least in one particular case, of one of his detractors, Bayani detractors, that these Baha'is should drink the blood of this person.
And this story was also corroborated by one certain gentleman, Mirza Javad,
Yes, Mr. Javad
originally,
Khan.
originally one of Baha'u'llah's Karuni, who defected to Iran,
Yes,
apparently held falling out with Baha and Abdul Baha, But the thing is, this guy, Nasir Baghdadi, after Baha'u'llah's death, was unusually looked after,
yes,
by Abbas Effendi,
yes, he was. Yeah,
right?
he was maintained. This is a pattern that we see with a lot of these cronies. That as long as they toe the line, they're very well taken care of, right? If they dissent, etc., then they meet the sort of fate that Nabil Zarandi met.
Okay, tell me about the Nabil Zarandi, by the way.
Well,
This guy.
Zarandi, according to the information that the Bayanis have, and that's actually written down at the end of Hashtahisht, after Baha'u'llah dies, Zarandi starts to make claims on his own behalf. Earlier, he had also been doing this back in the early Baghdad period, and Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah had kind of convinced him to put these
he did it
claims
on
aside.
multiple occasions.
He did it on multiple occasions, and then once Baha'u'llah dies, he once again starts making claims. And according to Hashbehesh and according to a few other narratives from the Bayanis, the Baha'is had him killed. And then once they had him killed, then they created this whole story about how he could not bear to be separate from his beloved, so he drowned himself in the Mediterranean. The fact of the matter is they killed him.
And I believe, Wahid, actually, Edward Brown's narrative is an honest, well-written account, that offers a lot about this heinous and gruesome murder, right?
Yes. Yeah. He relies on Hashbehesh and a few other narratives, but overall, E.G. Brown's, give or take a few gaps here and there, overall, E.G. Brown did a pretty decent job of I mean, he was balanced. He was as objective as one can be, but he I think his conclusions were correct fundamentally.
And many of the Bayanis who were banished to Akka were actually homeless, sick,
Yes.
Yeah. More permanent accommodation, than that offered by the Ottoman, officers, and authorities, and they also, fell quite unfavored, by both Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. Is that true?
Yes. One story here that the Baha'is love to peddle, and it is one of the issues that I believe that mobilized Mujan Momin and these pseudo scholars to get my article with Die Welt Islam tanked, was that the Baha'is claim that one of the sons of Sopa Azad, Ahmed al-Samari, went to Haifa and became a Baha'i.
Right.
There is no truth to this.
I believe again out of sheer destitute.
Well, he came to Palestine.
He was working on railways.
Yeah, he came to Palestine as the First World War was winding down. The Turks had been defeated. There had been a revolution. The position of the Sultan was untenable. The entire imperial apparatus of that system was falling apart. The whole country was falling apart. So he basically left Istanbul and came to Palestine. And well, I mean, it so happened that Abbas Effendi was his extended family, so he went, to Abbas Effendi as a family member, not as a believer. The Baha'is basically have manufactured a story that he had converted to Baha'ism. Now, what's interesting is that this narrative about his conversion actually first occurs in a piece that the Baha'is published in the 1960s. So prior to this period, there was no evidence at all in any piece of writing that he had, converted to Baha'ism. He died in Haifa and he's buried in Haifa. But here's the interesting thing: we have found works of Subh Azal transcribed in his hand from the very period that the Baha'is claim that he had converted to Baha'ism. So the question arises as to how is that possible that one of the sons of Subh Azal, who had come to Palestine, converts to Baha'ism, and when he has converted, he is still transcribing the works of his own father. This creates a contradiction. But, the Baha'is peddle these narratives.
Didn't it raise a lot of red flags?
It raises red flags with any person, who examines this trajectory. And in fact, Al-Vareh, in his Kashful, he relates the fact that he had been instructed first by Abbas Effendi and then soon thereafter by Shoghi to try to get a denunciation of Subh Azal out of him. And he had refused categorically. Right? But yet he died in Haifa, far away from Istanbul and also far away from Cyprus. And, the Baha'is have claimed him as one of their own, although he never was. He never
the refutations, about the Baha'i teachings and stories, rarely comes alone, right? Usually one followed by another. However, finally, another cognitive dissonance can be revisited again. The beautifully constructed house of Baha, was made, I believe, to conform to a way of life, intended, apparently to help the poorest of the poor, right? Large sitting rooms were turned into dormitories, where beds were crowded together. The heat remained of all winter, in this exceedingly damp house, that was accommodated to his followers. That's disgusting.
Look, not only disgusting, but what it reveals is that this individual was following the path of a typical typecast cult leader, right? He will live in comfort, total comfort, while his actual followers and the people that are putting themselves out there for him are languishing. Now, contrast this with the career of the Primal Point and even Subh Azal. During the entire 6 years of the ministry of the Primal Point, he was either on the run, or in prison, in remote, fortresses like the one in Malku and then the one finally in Chehriq. But you look at Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri, despite what the Baha'is claim, but when you actually go to Palestine and see these places or look at pictures of them online or elsewhere, you realize that this guy was really living the high hog. He was having an extremely comfortable life. He was reigning, in other words. Like he was living like a king. And E.G. Brown, to his utter credit, when he relates that whole story about how he was taken to the audience of Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri Baha'ullah, and the kind of Hollywood extravaganza and gala that they put on, an act of theater, as they were taking him to meet Baha'u'llah, is actually testimony to this fact. And the contrast between the lifestyle of Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri, the Primal Point himself in Iran during the 6 years of his ministry, and Subh Azal, who lived extremely humbly.
And despite the Primal Point steadfastly, endeavored actually to ward off any cult of personality, it is reported, very well documented, that Baha'u'llah, for instance, according to, Tarazullah Khan, Tarazullah Khan, he usually looked right through you and demanded loyalty, right? What did give rise to this kind cult of personality, right?
He did this in a number of occasions. He had already been doing that in Baghdad, but on several occasions, one notable one is the story of Badi, this kid with sort of Down syndrome, who was supposed to deliver this letter to Nasruddin Shah. When his
Why?
father,
Why did he send, a mentally disabled teenager, to carry a message to the king? Was he out of his senses, or
because he
was it?
realized that someone of his incapacity would be the only one who would accept this mission. And then after he is killed and actually tortured to death, according to the Baha'i sources and accounts themselves, then they fabricate this entire martyrology and martyr narrative around this kid. But the fact is that his father, once he came into the audience of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, was basically blackmailed, right, according to Baha'i accounts themselves, into giving up his son and also himself in the path of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri from
So he
Mirza
got the
Hussein Ali
teenager
Nuri's own
killed.
mouth.
He got the teenager killed, and he
Yes,
blackmailed the
the
father
father.
to incapacitate him. Right?
Yes, yes,
Wow! It
yeah.
blew me away. Wow!
The primal
He was the biggest
neither
person.
you could search through the entire writings of the primal point and Sopa Azal. Never, anywhere, at any time did they demand any of the believers to willingly, for their sake, lay their life down. They were quite unequivocal that if you can save and maintain your life, do so. But Mirza
And
Hussein Ali Nuri demanded the blood of his own believers.
yes, yes, he
Constantly.
demanded the blood, and he said that, uh, putting their lives, putting their lives, and actually sacrificing, their lives, their family, is encumbrance,
Yes.
to any true Baha'i,
Yeah.
in a way makes it again a dangerous cult of personality.
Well, you know, let me put it to you this way. Um, and I don't really care what people in Iran may think about this, but you compare this demand of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri for blood and the same one from Ayatollah Khomeini right at the very beginning of the revolution, especially that very famous speech of his after the assassination of Motahari.
They both bore a tight
Yeah,
resemblance
Ayatollah
on
Khomeini
that
said it
matter.
himself. Shed your blood. We want blood. Should we, shed your blood? This was exactly the same mentality as Baha'u'llah's. Exactly the same mentality. In fact, these two resemble each other in so many ways. Ayatollah Khomeini and Mirza Hossein Ali Nouri. Although I think maybe Khomeini was a lot more smarter and a far more politically savvy a figure than Mirza Hossein Ali Nouri. But they resemble each other. There is so much similarity between Khomeini and Baha'u'llah. It's unbelievable. Someday, somebody, in my opinion, needs to write this comparative study of the careers of these two because they're so alike.
And according to Ustad Muhammad Ali Salmani, so-called Ustad Muhammad Ali Salmani, actually he was only, a thug. He
Yeah.
was no Ustad, he was no master, actually. Uh, anyway, according to him, Baha'u'llah was disturbed, on a visit, paid by, some of his followers complaining about the situation. He was disturbed that the poor, were the ones who suffered from Baha'u'llah's high-profile gangsters, self-righteous adherence to poverty. You know, it's actually he's skewed and manipulated. his
This
followers.
this was also the observation of Mirza Khan Kermani in his own account of the visit that he made to Akka. He said this point blank, what you just said. So we have multiple accounts, and also someday if we can get our hands on the accounts of the Ottoman officials, if some of these are still existing, of their observations about these folks at the time, I am almost certain that they will say exactly the same things that the Bayanis have been saying.
And money, that huge
Yeah,
amount of
he
money
had,
lingered unproductively in his account. Is that true?
yeah,
And he
100%.
had a trustee. He got a trustee,
Yeah,
a Jewish dissident by the name of Haji Amin.
yes.
Tell me about Haji Amin.
Well, you know more about Haji Amin than I do. You've been reading quite a fair bit about him lately. Go
Yes,
ahead. You tell us. You
he
tell us.
was. You know that he was a corrupt, and he was sexually disturbed person, you know. And by the way, I should mention this, like the title Haji has nothing whatsoever to do with, pilgrimage to Mecca. It's rather got everything to do with paying a visit to so-called Shams Haqiqat Baha'ullah, that charlatan, that mountebank. Is that true, by the way?
Yeah, yeah, that is true.
So anybody, categorically speaking, anybody who paid a visit to Baha'u'llah, could ultimately become a Haji, a pilgrim, right?
That's what happened. This is the thing. You have all these
So
hajis
he
who
graduated
never who
from.
never went to Mecca.
So
Um,
do you think he graduated from a mobster to some god?
this is the thing. I don't know if you looked in too much into the Osho cult, but this is exactly the same thing, except far more salacious than even this Osho cult in terms of the monetary corruption of these people. Um, yeah, it's exactly the same story. This was a mafia where the central figure of it had claims of divinity.
And you said he could, divert any kind of attention, any kind of investigation due to, a very nasty strategy, called, plausible deniability, right?
This
Because
is all
apparently to
everything that these
argue
people have done, even to this very day. This is one of their strategies: plausible deniability. Uh, you know,
that said, we didn't get orders, from, for instance, House of Justice directly. They were given orders, by some counselors, some
yes,
continental counselors, right?
yeah,
So they function as a bunch of buffers,
yes,
inside.
just like a mafia does. Exactly, and this is exactly the manner in which capital regimes operate through
And who did,
buffers.
who did first come up with this mafiasque style? It was down to Baha'u'llah or
He did
Ayatollah.
himself, as far as we are aware, right, and as far as these Qajar era the chronicles and diplomatic dispatches show us, this started to become the reality of that organization in Baghdad as early as I would say probably 1854. That we have actually written evidence from Qajar diplomatic dispatches that yeah, these people have created a mafia in Baghdad and throughout Iraq, where pilgrims were being shaken down, people were being shaken down, violence, extortion, all the rest of it, all happening under watch of Baha'u'llah and masterminded by him at the
But
same time.
it's mind blowing that this thug succeeded in attracting two ostentatious worshippers. As
Well,
you once said,
we're
as you once
we're
said,
living
Hassan
we're
al-Yuzi. Let me
we
come.
are we are
Uh,
living at the tail end of the Donald Trump era.
oh
Um, it,
yes, oh yes.
we have experienced the last 4 or 5 years of a complete gangster and thug taking the highest office in the United States, and bamboozling millions of people, not just within the United States itself, but also outside of the United States, thanks to his gangster friends in Russia and elsewhere, into believing that this guy is some kind of a hero. When, right in your face, you see this guy as a criminal, and that everything he's doing is an iteration of some form of criminality, right? So the question is, how can they pull wool over people's eyes? There's something, there is unfortunately a blind spot in many human beings, and the Bayan actually even addresses this in various places, and so does the Quran, for that matter, where human beings who really don't have a grip of their own mind and a grip on their own soul, or it is always very easy for them to fall into these sorts of traps. But the number of human beings who really have a grip on their own mind and soul is so few in every age, right? And they are willing to see, and especially if they get into a desperate state, they are willing to see the devil as God and the God as devil. See everything in an inverted capacity. And in this particular age that we're living in, this seems to be a very predominant narrative. We saw it also in Iran for the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini painted himself as literally the incarnate Imam, said some very wonderful things, and then once he sets foot in Iran, just rivers and oceans of blood spread all over the country. None of the promises that were made in Paris, or even the promises that were made when he first came back to Iran, were ever kept. This is the thing: the capacity for human beings to tell the difference between truth and falsehood is very, very few, because that faculty is a very, very fine and very it's a faculty that not every human being possesses, because it requires a lifetime of inner struggle and inner refinement and constant thinking, reading, reasoning, meditation, all of that, the whole thing. The Quran, in my opinion, the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, is one of the greatest pieces of scripture, of any world scripture, that really unpacks that kind of psychology of human beings and why they keep falling into falsehood over and over again. And in this particular age of post-truth, where a complete gangster in the form of Donald Trump took the presidency of the United States, and you had this many people believing this guy was some kind of a political messiah, and including from the churches in the United States, it's extremely instructive for historians of the future to look at such a phenomena and then read into it what could have happened in that era in Baghdad and Aderna, and why someone like Mirza Hussein Ali Nouri managed to bamboozle so many thousands of these Babis in Iran into believing and following him.
And could you possibly provide me with some insight as to Baha'ullah's treatment of people? Because according to Sopi, Fazlullah or Fazlullah Sopi, the Huququllah trustee, this Haji Amin or his protege, Amin, that's funny. Anyway, these trustees were rarely allowed to spend money, right, on the poor,
Yeah.
that they were trying to help. Instead, they were forced to plead poverty, thus manipulating, generous, credulous people and enterprise into giving more goods, service, and cash. However, Hassan al-Yuzi, another apparatchik of the Baha'i machinery, outright said, quote, the flood of donation was considered to be a sign of God's approval of Baha'ullah's congregation and dispensation.
Right.
Tell me about it.
Well, my first question is that when you had the vast majority of these people in the surrounding areas of Palestine and the Levant destitute, with nothing, barely able to feed their families, where were these contributions coming from? They certainly weren't coming from Baha'is in Iran, because during that particular period, most of these people were poor. But Baha'u'llah had the Afnan family in his pocket, who at that very time, had the most lucrative market of trading in opium throughout that entire region. right?
And do not forget to mention the Jews behind it.
Well, the early Jews that came into the Baha'ism were not the wealthy Jews. Those came during at least the beginning of the period of Abbas Effendi. For the period of Baha'u'llah himself, a lot of this money came from the Afnan family, from the wealth that he was bequeathed from Musa Jawahiri, and then monies that he was getting on a wide level from the Baha'is of Iran. Um, but the trade in opium by the Afnan family, and this is the side of the family of the Bab that during the lifetime of the primal point, we need to emphasize this, were the ones that actually shunned the primal point. This uncle of the primal points that came to Baghdad and for which Baha'u'llah wrote the Kitab al-Iqan, the Risaleh Khalu'iyeh, was actually someone that the primal point had labeled as Abu Jah,
Right.
because he had dismissed the claims of the primal point. This is his own family members. Okay, so but these people, once they came into the fold with the Baha'is, they established an extremely lucrative trade from Hong Kong to Bombay to Iran, all the way to Palestine in opium, and they actually were the people responsible for the opium trade coming to Iran.
So
Was this Afghan family?
that's how the donations, rolled in and were deposited,
Yeah,
in accounts, but they had no effect whatsoever, on people's aesthetic lives, or on the
because
lives of the
they
poor.
didn't because these people such as the Afghan family didn't have an ascetic life. They were quite the opposite. They were living the high hog.
Right. However, without an audit, of course, it's impossible, to say with certainty what
But hold on,
became of.
just before you go on, this is what we should say very unequivocally, that the public, for example, the publication schedule of certain works of Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri, these were all funded with Afghan money. This was drug money. So these people were drug dealers, right? And these works that then were diffused, were published in places like Bombay, were published and then diffused all over the world with drug money, with
Right.
trade in narcotics.
And here pops up, another small hypocrisy concealing, a much greater one. Hassan Badiouzi writes, quote, "Our constitution forbade us to beg, sorry, our constitution forbade us to beg for more than we needed. But the money in possession was treated as if it did not exist." That is a lie. And
That's
thus,
absolutely a lie.
the,
I mean,
the affectation of modesty.
their own histories from the very people. Like, for example, this what was this name? The one that Brown translates in his materials for the study of the Bobby religion, materials for the study of the Bobby religion. He himself confesses to the fact that they were living extremely sparsely, that they had very little money. So if that is the case, if this was from the flock of Baha'u'llah in Palestine and Levant, and we know for a fact that the majority of the Baha'is of that time, during the lifetime of Baha'u'llah, were not wealthy, the ones in Iran, right? So there were two classes of people. There were, these hyper wealthy merchants, etc., like the Afnans, who then incidentally married into the family of Baha'u'llah subsequently, right? And then there was everybody else. The
So,
Aghnamullah. The Aghnam. These are the Aghnamullah. I mean, he uses the phraseology himself. This is Baha'u'llah's own terminology, Aghnamullah, the sheep of God, the cattle of God.
helpless, hopeless infants,
Yeah.
I believe, Vahid, the rich world likes and wishes to believe that someone, somewhere in Eka, in Palestine, is doing something, for the poor. For this reason, it does not inquire too closely into the ulterior motives or practice of anyone who fulfills, however viciously this mandate, you know. So the great white hope, if I may say so, meets the great black hole here. The mission of the heathen blends with, some sort of comforting myth of Florence Nightingale. As ever, the true address of Baha'u'llah's missionary is the self-satisfaction, of the sponsor and the donor, and not to the needs of downtrodden, right? So I believe they are in no position to complain, and their, passivity and, abjection is considered sterling trait, right? It
No.
is time to recognize that the world's leading exponent of this false consolation, is himself, Baha'u'llah, a demagogue, an obscuranist, and a servant of earthly powers.
Reactionary. Baha'u'llah, Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah embodies a reactionary figure. He reminds me a lot, in fact, also of this, this 20th century cult leader, Frithjof Schuon, except Schuon was far more intelligent and much better read than Baha'u'llah was. But even there, you see this very reactionary kind of attitude where, the established powers are appealed to, where money is lauded. People with money amongst this flock are seen as being bestowed and endowed by God. Whereas in a spiritual narrative, as the Bible itself says, the meek are the true elites, and the worldly elites are the ones that are at the very bottom. So a genuine spiritual narrative always lauds the poor, the meek, the destitute, the downtrodden as the true creme de la creme in the eyes of the Almighty, not these rich, blood-sucking parasites. But the Baha'is, you see this, and you also see this also in their modern diction, where, for example, the universality of justice appeals to the Baha'is to teach and convert people of capacity. And what they mean by that are millionaires, celebrities, etc. They're not interested in average people. They're not interested in the working classes or the proletarians. They're going in the opposite direction. They want so-called elites. They want people with money, what they call people of capacity. And this has been a consistent strain in the overall narrative of Baha'ism from the very moment that Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri made his claim. And what I don't understand, at least but I do understand why, but what I, trying to piece together is how is it that Westerners, especially these very liberal, educated Westerners, people like Juan Cole, or even the Marshalls, or etc., rather than buy into the platitudes and the sound bites, right? When this actual narrative of what I'm saying is right in front of them, in even the official Baha'i histories, when you piece certain elements together, right? Why do they refuse to see it?
Actually, Wahid, this heterosexual and scrupulously neutralized and passive narrative of Yuan Ko actually sets stage for this catastrophe.
Yeah.
For instance, we know that reverence for life, especially, in its vulnerable condition, expressed by the poor Baha'is, is a sin, according to the Baha'i teachings,
Sure.
and one causes
And
great.
it's not only that. I mean, in the Kitab al-Aqdas, you're not allowed to give to the poor. You're not allowed to give to beggars. That is a sin in the Baha'ism. So zakat, that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and also the bayan, is considered a sin in Baha'ism.
So you believe the nobility of, these quote-unquote essential teachings of Baha'u'llah is sordidly compromised by this fact, right?
Well, from the very beginning, absolutely. Yeah, 100% it's compromised. And this is what gets me about, figures like Cole and the Marshalls and all of these white liberal Western Baha'is who continue with this charade and, still think that, Baha'u'llah actually had something to teach, right? Look, I've said this once before, I'll say it again. Since we're living in this tail end of the Donald Trump era, and this whole post-truth and fake news these are terminologies that have occurred during the last 4 or 5 years. I have said this for a long time. The Baha'is in the modern period are the very inventors of post-truth and fake news, right? And they strategized and they utilized every form of underhanded connivance that you could imagine to get to where they are, right? But luckily, in this age of the explosion of information, not all of this is, they cannot maintain this narrative forever. Just like Donald Trump and MAGA cannot maintain their narrative forever.
Okay, because time is almost up. I believe one last question.
Sure.
Right. On that tone, going back to my first question, why Mirza Abul-Fazl Golpaigani, eventually broke off the character to open up a little bit to that young follower? What happened to that?
He was disenchanted. He got into an argument with Abbas Effendi, much of it having to do with the fact that Abbas Effendi didn't see it expedient for him to continue with the Kashf al-Ghata. There's suggestions that the stipend that Mirza Abul-Fazl was usually getting weren't coming at that point, so the money wasn't coming anymore. And so,
by the way, is it true, Vahid? Is it true that he lost his diligence and touch with writing because he failed, to write some impressive book? Kashf al-Ghata, is a modest, and actually, I believe,
it's a screed. Kashf al-Ghata is a screed. It's a polemic. It's even embarrassing, so much so that Abbas Effendi himself ordered this book to be taken out of circulation. But at that tail end of that period, just before his death, he had enough. And so, that point of the breakage of cognitive dissonance with Mirza Abul-Fazl, he had reached that point, and so he opened up, and he was, probably realized that his days were numbered anyway, so he might as well talk. And he said what he said.
And he said in Arabic, "Inna Abbas Effendi rajulan siyasi, fakhada'na biruhaniyatihi."
Yeah.
He was he
was a political man and not a spiritual figure. Yeah.
And we all fell for his deceit.
And we all fell for his deceit. Yeah. We all fell for his deceit, but they fell for his deceit not out of any conviction, but with cash. These people had cash. Baha'u'llah had cash. Cash is what got him to where he got, not God, but cash. Same with Donald Trump.
Thank you very much, Vahid. This is, the last part of this program called Baha'u'llah in Theory and Practice. Nice talking to you.
Until next time.
Bye.